Andrés Escobar. June 22, 1994. Andrés Escobar scored an own goal at the World Cup, and 10 days later, he was killed. At 27, he was Colombia's star defender known as the Gentleman of Football. Colombia had crushed Argentina 5-0 in qualifying and arrived at the 1994 World Cup as tournament favorites. But this team wasn't just carrying a nation's hopes. Drug cartels had bet millions on Colombia winning, the same cartels that averaged 80 murders a week in Medellin, hometown of Andrés. Unlike teammates who accepted gifts from cartel bosses, Escobar always refused, knowing it was blood money. On June 22nd, facing the United States, Escobar stretched to block a cross and deflected it into his own net. Colombia lost 2-1 and was eliminated while the cartels lost fortunes. On returning, Escobar wrote an article titled, "Life Doesn't End Here," still believing football could unite his divided nation. He was days away from signing with AC Milan, but in a city ruled by cocaine money, defeat had a price. On July 2nd, after a night at El Indio nightclub, Escobar walked to his car around 3 a.m. In the parking lot, he was confronted by cartel associates, the Galan brothers, business partners of future President Alvaro Uribe. They shouted at him about the own goal, taunting him for costing them money. As Escobar tried to walk away, their bodyguard Humberto Muñoz Castro drew a handgun. He fired 6 shots, screaming, "Goal!" with each one echoing the commentator from the broadcast of Escobar's own goal. Later, the gunman served just 11 years while the Galan brothers walked free. Over 120,000 mourners filled Medellin streets, grieving a man who believed football was about honor, killed by those who saw it only as a transaction. Albert Ebossé. August 23, 2014, Algeria. In the 27th minute, Cameroonian striker Albert Ebossé converted a penalty kick, scoring the only goal for JS Kabylie in a 2-1 home defeat. As the final whistle blew, frustrated fans began hurling objects. Officials said a slate struck Ebossé. He sank to the ground and died hours later at a hospital in Tizi Ouzou. This was the story. The 24-year-old had been the Algerian league's top scorer with 17 goals the previous season. The league suspended play, closed stadiums, and called it a tragedy of fan violence. But 4 months later, the story began to crumble. Dr. André Moon, a Cameroonian pathologist hired by Ebossé's family, conducted a second autopsy that contradicted everything. His findings were explosive. Severe skull indentation requiring close-range force, dislocated left shoulder indicating violent struggle, ruptured cervical vertebrae, and a collarbone wound consistent with a knife attack. He concluded Albert hadn't been hit by a rock. He had been beaten to death. Video footage reviewed by investigators showed Ebossé walking into the locker room under police escort, alive and uninjured. Somewhere between the tunnel and the dressing area, something happened, and no one has ever explained what. Meanwhile, a French journalist who investigated the case was sentenced to prison in Algeria on charges of creating a false story. In a shocking betrayal, the club and league abandoned the family completely. His father told the BBC that the promised compensation never arrived, and no one from the club ever called to offer condolences, not even his teammates. He added, "My son was murdered." 10 years later, that remains the only statement that fits the facts. Otávio Jordão da Silva. June 30, 2013, Pio 12th, Brazil. Otávio Jordão, a 20-year-old referee, rode his bike to a local match. Within 3 hours, he would stab a player to death and be lynched by spectators on the same field. Pio XII was a remote town in northeastern Brazil where the murder rate had doubled in a decade. Police were outnumbered 7-1 and only 5% of homicides were ever solved. So when the law couldn't reach, private revenge eventually filled the void. The match was played on a dirt field with wooden goalposts. 15 minutes into the second half, Otávio gave a red card to 30-year-old Josemir Santos Abreu. When Abreu refused to leave the pitch, the argument escalated into something that couldn't be taken back. Abreu called Otávio's dead mother a whore and punched him to the ground. When Otávio got back up, he was holding a knife. In a moment of blind rage, he stabbed Abreu twice in the chest. Players rushed Abreu to the hospital, but he was dead on arrival. Spectators tied Otávio with rope. 7 calls to police met the same recording, officers out of service range. For over an hour, he remained bound on the field while the crowd grew. Abreu's friends arrived drunk on cachaca. They beat him with bottles and wooden stakes. One man drove a motorcycle over his body. Then Francisco de Souza arrived with a sickle. He decapitated Otávio and severed both lower legs before placing the head on a fence post. The referee and the player both died that day, one by the other's hand and the other by the crowd's. Luciano Re Cecconi. Rome, January 18, 1977. Luciano Re Cecconi, the blonde angel of Lazio, walked into a jewelry store for what he thought would be a harmless prank, but that turned out to be his last. At just 28, Re Cecconi was the heartbeat of Lazio's legendary first-ever Serie A title win in 1974. Off the pitch, he was beloved by teammates for his humor, often diffusing tensions in a divided dressing room. On that fatal day, Cecconi and teammates had the perfect joke in mind. Teammate Fraticcioli would enter the shop first, acting as a genuine customer. Re Cecconi and another teammate, Gideon, would then burst in with their jackets pulled over their faces, pretending to be armed robbers. The shock would turn to laughter when they revealed themselves as local football stars. They thought the jeweler would curse at them, and they'd have a great pub story. What could go wrong? They stormed in shouting, "Mani in alto! Questa è una rapina! Hands up, this is a robbery!" Gaydon immediately saw the shop owner, Bruno Tabocchini, reach behind the counter. He knew the prank was over and raised his hands. But Re Cecconi, not seeing the danger, continued forward with the act. Tabocchini, robbed just 10 days earlier, lifted a shotgun and fired at point-blank range into Re Cecconi's chest. As he lay dying, Re Cecconi's final words were chilling. "Era uno scherzo, solo uno scherzo." It's a joke, just a joke. He died 30 minutes later at San Giacomo Hospital, leaving behind a wife and 2 children. The investigation revealed a cruel twist of fate. Tabocchini was not a football fan and didn't recognize the star. A judge later ruled the shooting a tragic accident and a case of self-defense, releasing Tabocchini without charge. The blonde angel's face still adorns banners at Stadio Olimpico, a lasting tribute to a life cut short by one terrible mistake. Peter Biaksangzuala. October 14, 2014, Mizoram, India. Peter Biaksangzuala scored a dramatic equalizer and celebrated with a backflip. It would be his final moment of joy as the landing severed his spinal cord, and 5 days later, the 23-year-old was dead. Peter had grown up in Kauzal, a small village in the hills of Mizoram, working his way through local clubs to reach the Mizoram Premier League. Playing for Bethlehem Ventlang FC, he scored in the 62nd minute against Chanmari West, tying the match at 1-1. The backflip was a celebration inspired by German striker Miroslav Klose, a move Peter had practiced and performed successfully many times before. But this time, his body rotated too slowly. His head struck the turf at the wrong angle. Players ran to his aid as Peter lay motionless on the pitch. An ambulance sped him to a hospital, where a CT scan revealed catastrophic spinal cord damage. Peter slipped into a coma and remained unresponsive. On October 19th, doctors removed life support. In a final act of grace, his eyes were donated, giving 2 patients the gift of sight. His club retired jersey number 21. Indian sports broadcasters banned the celebration video, but by then, it had already spread across social media. The incident sparked debate about banning acrobatic goal celebrations, though no formal rules were ever implemented. Lutz Eigendorf. March 5, 1983, West Germany. Lutz Eigendorf, a 24-year-old footballer who had defected from East Germany 4 years earlier, died when his car crashed into a tree on a forest road near Braunschweig. Police blamed drunk driving, but declassified Stasi files would later reveal something else. The East German secret police had been tracking him with 50 agents and 20 informants under an operation codenamed Rose. Eigendorf had been East Germany's rising star, a midfielder for BFC Dynamo Berlin, the club controlled by the Stasi. In March 1979, during a friendly match in West Germany, he slipped away from his team during a walk and defected. His escape humiliated the Stasi and enraged its chief, Erich Mielke, who took defections as personal betrayals. Unlike other defectors who stayed silent, Eigendorf gave interviews criticizing the East German regime, even filming segments in front of the Berlin Wall. Fellow defector Jörg Berger warned him repeatedly, but those warnings proved tragically true on March 5, 1983. That night at 11:08 p.m., police found Eigendorf's car wrapped around a tree on a wet forest road. He died 2 days later from head and chest injuries. Contrary to the high alcohol claim, witnesses insisted he appeared sober. His widow disputed the toxicology results, yet no forensic examination of the car was ever conducted and no autopsy was performed. In 2010, former Stasi informant Karl-Heinz Felgner testified he had received an assassination order. Some believe he was kidnapped, force-fed poisoned alcohol, then released where another vehicle flashed him. In any case, one truth remains: you don't humiliate the Stasi and walk away free. Valtencir Pereira Senra. It was a challenge seen a million times in a football match. A loose ball and 2 players committed to winning it. But on September 17, 1978, in Maringá, Brazil, this routine play ended in an irreversible tragedy. Valtencir Pereira Senra, a 31-year-old defender for Colorado, went in for the ball at the same moment Grêmio Maringá midfielder Nivaldo reached it. Nivaldo arrived first and jumped to clear it, raising his knee as players do instinctively to protect themselves. Valtencir, sliding in from behind, couldn't stop. Nivaldo's knee struck him in the back of the neck with full, brutal force, and Valtencir hit the ground unconscious. Born in Juiz de Fora, Valtencir had reached the pinnacle of Brazilian football in 1968 when he represented his country against Argentina at Maracanã, scoring in a 4-1 victory. At 31, he was still playing with the same fearless commitment that had defined his career, throwing himself into every challenge. The impact had caused 3 cervical fractures and completely severed his spinal cord. Medical staff carried him off the field while players from both sides realized that something catastrophic had occurred. He was immediately moved to Santa Rita Hospital but died shortly after arrival and never woke again. Word spread through the stadium before the second half could begin. Valtencir was dead. But the tragedy had a second victim, Nivaldo. When he learned Valtencir had died, he dropped on the pitch. Though witnesses immediately confirmed the collision was accidental, the psychological weight of having killed another player devastated him. He withdrew from football for weeks and only returned in October after extensive counseling. Emiliano Sala. For Emiliano Sala, January 2019 was the biggest moment of his career. The Argentine striker, who had scored 12 goals, tying Kylian Mbappé for the League One lead, earned a £15 million move to Cardiff City. But the dream became a nightmare 2 days later. After signing his contract, Sala returned to France to say goodbye to his teammates at Nantes. On the evening of January 21st, he boarded a small private aircraft flown by amateur pilot David Ibbotson to fly to what should have been his new life in Wales. Critically, Ibbotson lacked a license to carry paying passengers and was not legally permitted to fly at night. Before takeoff, a sense of dread was already setting in. Sala sent a haunting WhatsApp voice message to his friends. In a voice filled with anxiety, he said, "I'm on a plane that looks as though it's going to fall apart." An hour after 7:15 p.m. takeoff, the plane began descending to avoid heavy cloud cover at 5,000 feet. Then, 22 miles north of Guernsey, it vanished from radar. A massive 3-day official search found nothing. Then a public outcry led to a crowd-funded effort, raising over £280,000, which located the wreckage 13 days later on February 3rd. Lying at a depth of 63 meters, Sala's body was recovered, but Ibbotson's was never found. His death sparked ongoing legal battles. Cardiff refused to pay the £15 million transfer fee, but relented after FIFA ruled against them. They then sued Nantes for €120 million, arguing Sala's goals would have kept them in the Premier League.